This video is about the connections between Noah and the letter to Sardis, which we find in the book of Revelation. Sardis was a city which was built on the spur of a mountain, and it was very difficult for opposing armies to capture. But it was captured more than once throughout history when those in charge of watching in the city failed to do their duty correctly. One occasion when the city of Sardis was captured was in 546 BC by the Persians under Cyrus. This was when the city was under Croesus, who was the last king of the Lydian Empire. And this is actually spoken of in Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 3, where it says of Cyrus, "And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, Yahweh, which call thee by the name and the God of thy name, and the God of Israel." So we see then that the city was captured. All the riches which were in that city under Croesus were captured by the Persians, and despite the fact that it was built on a spur of a mountain, it was captured because the defenders of the city did not watch as they should have done. And this, of course, is a significant background for the letter to Sardis written by Christ, as we read of in Revelation chapter 3, where in verse 2 it says, "Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die." Believers in Sardis had to be spiritually watchful, unlike the inhabitants of the city in the past, who had not watched carefully enough to defend the city. But we see a parallel between Sardis and the days of Noah, where the people during the days of Noah should have been spiritually watchful but were not. So what we're going to do now is just run through the links between Noah and the letter to Sardis in the book of Revelation. So we take the Old Testament first in Genesis, and in Genesis chapter 5 and verse 29 we read of these words. Speaking of Lamech, it says, "And he called his name Noah, saying, This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands." So we find there work spoken of, and of course it was the spiritual work which Noah was to perform, which would be so important. And in verse 2 of Revelation chapter 3 we read that Christ said, "I have not found thy works perfect before God." And of course it was the case that in the days of Noah, most people's work, apart from that of Noah, was not acceptable in the sight of God. In Genesis 6 verse 3 we read, "And Yahweh said, My spirit shall not always strive with man." So we have a reference there to God's spirit, and twice in Revelation chapter 3 we have reference to spirit. First of all, the spirits of God, which we'll mention again shortly. And in verse 6 of Revelation chapter 3 it says, "He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the ecclesias." In Genesis 6 and verse 4 it says there at the end of the verse, "The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." And the Hebrew word translated renown is the word a name. So these were men who had made a name for themselves. And the same was spiritually true in Sardis at that time, where Christ says, "I know thy works, that thou hast a name, that thou livest and art dead." So they had this name for themselves. Outwardly they seemed a spiritually alive ecclesia, but actually they were dead, as the Lord Jesus Christ said. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5 it says, "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth." So God could see what was happening at that time. And the same thing was happening in Revelation chapter 3, that God and the Lord Jesus Christ could see what was happening in Sardis. And so we read in verse 1 of Genesis of Revelation chapter 3, "These things saith he that hath the seven spirits of God and the seven stars. I know thy works, that thou hast a name, that thou livest and art dead. And that word I know is often translated see. So God saw in the days of Noah, and Christ says, I know, I see thy works. And in connection with that, in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 8, it says, but Noah found grace in the eyes of Yahweh. And in that verse 1 of Revelation chapter 3, we have reference to the 7 spirits of God. And in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 6, it says, and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God. So we can see that there's a link between the 7 spirits of God mentioned in Revelation chapter 3 and God seeing. So moving on, in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9, it says that Noah walked with God. So this is one of the main reasons for linking this letter with the book, the Revelation chapter 3, with the days of Noah. We find this very specific phrase, which isn't said of many people, that Noah walked with God. And we have a promise made in Revelation chapter 3, where Christ says, thou hast a few names even in Sardis, which have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. Now notice it's a future words there spoken. It's about what was going to happen in the future. Now, in order for somebody to walk with somebody else, that person needs to be there with them. And it's a very specific thing. It's not just talking about walking in the presence of somebody. Sometimes in the Old Testament we have words which speak of people walking with God, but actually it's to do with walking in his presence. But specifically, it's to do with walking with God. Now, in the case of Noah, this may well have involved him walking and talking with angels, perhaps around the site of the Garden of Eden, which would have been still there before the days of the flood. In the case of the promise made in Revelation chapter 3, it obviously refers to the kingdom, when the Lord Jesus Christ will return and will be walking on the earth, and hence the faithful will be able to walk with him. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 11, we have these words, the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. And so we have this reference to how this violence was being seen by God and was before him. It was brought before him, this terrible violence which was on the earth at that time. And so too we find the Lord Jesus Christ saying in verse 2 of Revelation 3, for I have not found thy works perfect before God. Now we've seen in verse 2 of Revelation chapter 3 that they were spiritually ready to die. And of course we get the similar words in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 17, where at the end of that verse God said, and everything that is in the earth shall die. And then in Genesis 7 and chapter 2 and verse 3 we have a reference to the animals being brought in by sevens, of fowls also of the air by sevens, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. And then we have reference, as well as the reference to the sevens in verse 2 and verse 3, we also have reference to 7 days, verse 4. So we get the recurrence of the number 7 in the record of Noah, and we've already seen that we have reference to 7 in Revelation 3 verse 1. These things saith he that hath the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. In Genesis chapter 9 and verse 1, God commands Noah after the flood, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And there the Hebrew for replenish just means fill, and in fact the word perfect in Revelation 3 verse 2, actually that means fill or fulfilled, for I have not found thy works fulfilled before God. So we've got a parallel meaning there. And then a couple of other references with regard to Noah, but this time not in Genesis but in the New Testament. First of all in Matthew and chapter 24 and verse 39, speaking of the days of Noah, Christ said that they knew not until the flood came and took them all away. And in verse 3 of Revelation chapter 3, it says at the end of verse, I will come on thee as a thief, and thou shalt not know what hour I will come upon thee. And so we can see a parallel there between the way that the flood suddenly came upon the people without the majority of them knowing it was going to come, and there's the same danger related to the believers in Sardis. And finally, in 1st of Peter and chapter 3 and verse 20, we have reference there to those who were in the ark, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water. So the number is referred to as few, and we have the same word used in Revelation chapter 3 verse 4. There has to few names even in Sardis. So in the end, only a few were saved in the days of Noah. And as it stood at the time of writing in Revelation chapter 3, only a few would be saved out of the ecclesia of Sardis. And so that provides a warning for us, because we know that the days in which we live are like the days of Noah, and therefore we too need to take heed to the letter which was given to the brothers and sisters at Sardis.